Meeting's yours.
Good afternoon, everyone. A virtual meeting of the MAG Management Committee is called to order. Please remember to mute your phone when you are not speaking. And Melissa, will you take roll call, please?
Yes, sure. I'll go down the list of members. Please indicate if you're present or serving as proxy, if not already indicated. Brian Powell.
Here.
Thank you. Katie Proctor.
Here.
Thank you. Tracy Stevens. For Avondale. Thank you. Roger Klingler.
Present.
Thank you. Gary Neese. Carrie Dyrek. Marcia Reed. Crystal Dykes.
Present.
Thank you. Brent Billingsley.
Present.
Thank you. Grady Miller. Kathy Valenzuela. Kathy, I think I saw her on. Patrick Banger or someone from Gilbert. Kevin Phelps.
Here.
Thank you. Jeff Kulaga.
Here.
Thank you. Bill Stevens. Jennifer Toth.
Here.
Thank you. Anyone from City of Maricopa? Chris Brady.
This is Ian Linson sitting in for Chris.
Okay, thank you, Ian. Jill Kymack.
Here.
Thank you. Jeff Tyne.
Here.
Thank you. Ed Zerker.
Here.
Thank you. Is anyone on from Pinal County?
This is Tammy Ryle for Lou Anderson.
Thank you, Tammy. John Cross.
Here.
Thank you. Alexis Tamron Kinsey.
Here.
Thank you. Scottsdale, Brad Lundahl.
Brad Lundahl is here.
Thank you. Mike Frazier.
Mike Frazier here.
Thank you. Marge Zila for Tempe.
Here.
Thank you. Reyes Medrano. Vince Lorfeis.
Present.
Thank you. Jeannie Blackman. And our chairwoman is present, so we do have a quorum.
All right, thank you. Our next item is call to the audience. Members of the public were asked to submit written comments related to this meeting through the MAG website. Comments may be sent at any time leading up to the meeting, but must be received at least 1 hour prior to the posted start time for the meeting. This is the opportunity for the public to comment on items that fall under MAG's jurisdiction that are not on the agenda or that are on the agenda for discussion and not for action. MAG staff, have we received any public comments? If so, please read them at this time.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman and members of the committee. We received no comments for this item or any other item on the agenda.
All right, thank you. We'll move on to agenda item number 3, Executive Director's Report. Eric Anderson will provide the report.
Thank you, Madam Chair. A few items to bring you up to speed on today. If we go to the next slide, I think we talked about the Luke Air Force Base Targeted Growth Management Plan. It won the Arizona chapter of the APA Planning Award last month. So very proud of it. We did a virtual launch on September 23rd, featuring Mayor Jerry Wires in Glendale and Brigadier General Gregory Cruder. The launch page has a number of videos and a demo of the mission critical tool. You might navigate over to that web page when you get a chance and check it out. Go to the next slide. The Census 2020 saga continues through a number of court battles. The federal court now has ruled that the Census Bureau must continue the count. This is the door-to-door canvassing through October 31 of 2020. Census Bureau did announce they're going to comply with that order. The good news is that the percentage of households counted self-response and in-person follow-up is almost 100% now, 99.5%. So it's good news for the state and for the region. Go to the next slide. October is National Pedestrian Safety Month. As you know, the Arizona and the MAG region has some serious issues related to pedestrian safety. Margaret Herrera did a presentation of the MAG Strategic Safety Plan last month with a particular emphasis on bicycle and pedestrian safety too. So it's apropos that we have that at October as National Pedestrian Safety Month. Next slide. October is also Domestic Violence Awareness Month. The Regional Council did pass a resolution at the meeting just last week, I guess it was, recognizing Domestic Violence Awareness Month. We're collecting on our schedules, on our website, events throughout the Valley recognizing domestic violence awareness, and hopefully you'll put some purple lights on your buildings too. Go to the next slide. Very proud that we just finished a peer review on our transportation modeling. The MAG ABM, which ABM stands for Activity Based Model. And it's now the official model of record. The ABM model has been under development for a number of years. We're very pleased to finally have it as our go-to modeling tool to do the transportation, the long-range transportation forecast. Very proud of the model. It's probably one of the best in the United States, if not around the world. So we'll be transitioning new model for all of our work, the planning work, as well as conformity analysis starting in next year in 2021. Go to the next slide. Finally, I'd like to say the Greater Phoenix Connective. The Connective is the consortium that we founded along with the Institute for Digital Progress and ASU, as well as a number of industry partners. The European Commission has selected the Greater Phoenix Connective to become a mentor to European cities in the Intelligent Cities Challenge. This is a great honor for the region, and I think it recognizes our efforts to continue to explore new technologies and how it can help improve the quality of life here in the Valley. So, Madam Chair, that completes my report. Thank you.
Thank you. Please contact Eric after the meeting if you have any questions regarding his report. So next we'll go to item number 4, which is approval of the consent agenda. Agenda items 4A through 4D are on the consent agenda. Does any member of the management committee have questions or like a presentation on any of the consent agenda items? Hearing none, can I have a motion to recommend approval of a consent agenda items 4A through 4D?
Roger from Buckeye, move approval.
This is Kevin.
Brady from Found Hills, second.
Okay, we have a motion from Roger and a second from Grady. Is there any discussion of the motion? All right, Melissa, can you take a roll call vote for me, please?
Yes, I will call your name. Please indicate how you vote. Bryant Powell. Katie Proctor.
Aye.
Thank you. Tracy Stevens.
Aye.
Thank you. Roger Klingler.
Aye.
Thank you. Marcia Reed.
Aye.
Thank you. Crystal Dykes.
Aye.
Thank you. Brent Billingsley.
Aye.
Thank you. Grady Miller.
Aye.
Thank you. Kathy Valenzuela.
Aye.
Thank you. Kevin Phelps.
Aye.
Thank you. Jeff Kulaga.
Aye.
Thank you. Jennifer Toth.
Aye.
Thank you. Ian Linson.
Aye.
Thank you. Jill Kymack.
Aye.
Thank you. Jeff Tyne.
Aye.
Thank you. Ed Zerker.
Yes.
Thank you. Tammy Ryle for Pinal County. Thank you. John Cross.
Aye.
Thank you. Alexis Tamron Kinsey.
Yes.
Thank you. Brad Lundahl.
Aye.
Thank you. Mike Frazier.
Aye.
Thank you. Marge Zila.
Aye.
Thank you. Vince Lorfeis.
Aye.
Thank you. Jeannie Blackman. And Chairwoman Arundel. How do you vote?
Aye.
Thank you. So that consent agenda passes unanimously.
Thank you. Item number 5 is the draft MAG policy principles. MAG Policy and Government Relations Director Nathan Pryor will provide a report.
Thank you, Madam Chair, members of the Management Committee. Today's item is on for action for recommended approval. Next slide, please. For the past several years, we've been bringing you the MAG policy principles for your consideration. These range from specific legislative positions to more broader roles and responsibilities. It's a good leave behind. You can see here, this is a trifold brochure format of the document. However, more importantly, it's an approved policy positions of our agency that we can utilize and draw upon throughout the year. From time to time, issues arise, and it's a good place to kind of go back to, if you will, having approved policy principles to draw upon and utilize. With that said, we can update it as needed. Next slide, please. This iteration is very similar from previous iterations. I just want to note a couple of the changes. The first is under the transportation policy and planning. We have added an enabling legislation statement. Want to thank the Maricopa County staff for working with us on that, and I'll speak more to that in a second here. And also, we've added a statement on prohibition of discrimination under our administration section. I'll touch on that here in a moment as well. Next slide, please. So regarding enabling legislation for extension of the house sales tax, as I stated, we had a statement in our draft policy principles that went on the consent agendas to the policy committees during the month of September. After some review and conversation with county staff, the statement was changed to what you see before you, and I'll go ahead and read it. Support the continued development of a MAG regional transportation plan, along with future pursuit of enabling legislation that would allow for extension of the regional tax for transportation to be put before the voters. So as the 2021 legislative session is upon us, this probably more accurately captures the process that we're in at this moment. We've heard from MAG member agencies regarding going with enabling legislation that perhaps more certainty in terms of the plan development, and outcomes would be desired before going to the legislature with enabling legislation. We believe that this statement captures that kind of ongoing process, if you will, still leading to our scenario development and ultimately a plan. Next slide, please. As I mentioned, we included a statement of prohibiting discrimination under our administration section this year. We felt that was important to show that we are abiding by federal laws and regulations, but also something to consider as in the delivery of our programs, that we as staff are mindful of discrimination issues and issues of equity and social justice. So we incorporated that into our policy principles this year. Next slide, please. Madam Chair, that concludes my presentation. I'm available for any questions. We did bring this to the Economic Development Committee yesterday. It will go to the Transportation Policy Committee on October 21st, and will go for Regional Council approval on October 28th. Thank you.
All right, thank you for that report. This item is on the agenda for action. Can I have a motion to recommend approval of the draft MAG policy principles?
So moved.
Who was that? Was that Jeff?
Colaga from going over.
Colaga. Thank you. And a second, please.
I second.
Patrick. All right, I have a motion from Jeff Colaga and a second from Patrick Banger. Is there any discussion of the motion? Hearing none, Melissa, can you take a roll call, please?
Yes, thank you, Madam Chairwoman. I will call your name. Please indicate how you vote. Bryant Powell.
Yes.
Thank you. Katie Proctor.
Yes.
Thank you. Tracy Stevens.
Yes.
Thank you. Roger Klingler.
Aye.
Thank you. Marcia Reed.
Aye.
Thank you. Crystal Dykes.
Aye.
Thank you. Brent Billingsley.
Aye.
Thank you. Grady Miller.
Aye.
Thank you. Kathy Valenzuela.
Yes.
Thank you. Patrick Banger.
Aye.
Thank you. Kevin Phelps.
Aye.
Thank you. Jennifer Toth.
Aye.
Thank you. Ian Linson.
Aye.
Thank you. Jill Kymack.
Aye.
Thank you. Jeff Tyne.
Aye.
Thank you. Ed Zerker.
Yes.
Thank you. Tammy Ryle.
Aye.
Thank you. John Cross.
Aye.
Thank you. Alexis Tamron Kinsey.
Aye.
Thank you. Brad Lundahl.
Aye.
Thank you. Mike Frazier.
Aye.
Thank you. Marge Zila.
Aye.
Thank you. Vince Lorfeis.
Aye.
Thank you. And Chairwoman Arundel.
Aye.
Thank you. So item 5 carries unanimously.
Thank you. Our next item is the update on the development of a new regional transportation plan. Ms. Audra Kester Thomas will give this update.
Thank you, Chairwoman Erdahl. Managers, pleased to be with you today to provide the latest update in the development of the next regional transportation plan. Next slide. So just a bit of an overview on today's presentation. We're going to be doing a bit of a history on the region's transit funding policy. We summarized this in a white paper that was distributed as part of your agenda packet today, and we'll be giving some of the highlights. We'll talk about the importance of local funding in delivering our regional transit system and how we have alternatives in looking forward to how we deliver transit outcomes and support from a regional perspective operating assistance of our bus transit network. We did present this information last week at the Management Committee work group, so we'll provide a bit of an overview of what we heard at that meeting and talk about next steps. I'm joined today by my esteemed colleague, John Bullen, MAG's Transportation Economic and Finance Program Manager, who will present the next slides. I'll turn it over to him.
Thank you very much, Audra, Madam Chair, members of the Management Committee. Very happy to be here today. Next slide, please. So as Audra had mentioned, I'll first give a little bit of history and context into what the system is today before looking at a couple of the important factors to consider as we try and sort out what we want transit to look like in the future and really where we want to go with the development of the next regional transportation plan. Next slide, please. So as we stated in the past, the RTP that was approved by the MAG Regional Council back in 2003 really was the basis for the Proposition 400 ballot initiative that was taken and subsequently approved by the voters back in 2004. As part of the planning process, policy decision was made to allocate approximately 33.33% of the total sales tax revenue to the transit program. This allocation is known as the Public Transportation Fund, or PTF for short. Also, additional policy decisions were made to allocate MAG FTA formula funds, as well as a portion of MAG's FHWA CMAQ funds to the transit element of the RTP. So the transit component of the RTP is managed by Valley Metro. That management occurs through the Transit Lifecycle Program, which really serves as the financial management tool to ensure that total revenues are in balance with total expenditures. Next slide, please. So of the 33.33% that is allocated to transit, here's the breakdown between the bus and the rail sides. So the rail component total back in 2003 represented approximately 45% of that total allocation, with the bus component making up the remaining balance. So the bus component's actually broken down into 3 additional groupings. There's the ADA, so that's funding for regional ADA operations. That totaled just over $200 million, which is about 7% of the total PTF allocation. And then the remaining balance was put into the bus component for bus operations, as well as associated capital to support that operation. So think about items like park and rides, bus purchases, bus replacements, and rehabs. Next slide, please. The transit component of the 2003 RTP, as well as the Proposition 400 plan, was really based under a plan approach, plan premise. So as part of that, prior to the 2003 RTP, the region saw a lot of inconsistencies in routes across the region. So what I mean by that is that really the service frequency in terms of number of trips per hour, span of service, days that operated were wildly inconsistent. And so as part of the effort for the 2003 RTP, a series of key regional routes were identified. These regional routes were termed Supergrid Routes. And the thought was that the region would provide funding to bring those routes up to a standard level of service across the valley. Next slide, please. So as part of that plan-based approach, not all the routes were initiated right when Proposition 400 collections started coming in. Routes were, an implementation plan was identified where some routes would start immediately in 2006, whereas some routes wouldn't come online until phase 4 of the plan, which is fiscal year 21 through 2026. Next slide, please. Similar concept was identified on the express bus side. So a number of new routes were identified. Regional funding was provided, and a phasing plan was established whereby some routes initiated right on the onset of Prop 400, and then other routes wouldn't start until throughout the sales tax collection horizon. Next slide, please. So a plan-based approach was taken really up until the Great Recession. And the Great Recession hit all of the life cycle programs hard, but in particular the transit program. So if you think about it, transit operations, the only regional funding source that can pay for transit operations is the half-cent sales tax. So whereby the arterial program and the freeway program, some of that hit was somewhat mitigated because we had other funding sources like federal funding. The entire 43% revenue drop for transit fell entirely on transit operations as well as transit capital. So as a result, a decision was made by the Valley Metro Board to move away from the plan-based model to more of a funding-based model. So a city-by-city allocation was determined based on the original 2003 amount. And cities were given the opportunity to allocate their funding accordingly. Next slide, please. So with the move away from a plan-based approach to more of a funding-based approach, there's implications there. And certainly the world looks a lot different today than it did back in 2003 and even 2009, 2010, when the Valley Metro Board approved the revisions to the policies and procedures. The population growth has changed, densities have changed, job centers have changed, and that all has implications on transit service. And so as we're trying to figure out how we want to tackle transit service moving forward, it's important to take that into consideration. So this chart demonstrates population growth as well as the city-by-city allocation known as the Jurisdictional Equity Allocation established in Valley Metro policies. Next slide, please. Now, before we move forward, I do want to provide some clarity. We've gotten several questions on this. I think it's important just to establish the baseline. So one of the key goals in the development of the 2003 RTP was geographic equity in investments. That is, there needed to be a balance in investments across the entirety of the region. So to do this, this was calculated based on all the different life cycle programs across the 3 different subregions. So while the transit percentages perhaps are a bit distorted towards certain portions of the valley, it's because investments were otherwise increased, for example, in the freeway program on the west side of the valley. So looking forward, it's just important to consider that. Next slide, please. So next I want to touch on the role of local funding, which, as Audrey had mentioned, plays a really critical role in the delivery of transit service across the region. Next slide, please. So as we've mentioned in the past, our region has a number of cities that have actually gone out and secured an additional tax for transportation investments throughout the years. In some cases, a large portion of that tax is allocated to transit. In fact, there are several cities where nearly the majority, if not the majority of that funds is allocated specifically to transit. And we see that in some of the data in terms of where the funding for transit actually comes from. Next slide, please. So the chart on the screen shows the proportion of funding contribution by agency towards transit operations. So a couple of elements that I would like to specifically draw your attention to. So the green bars represent local funding contributions. The blue bars represent federal funding contributions. That largely occurs with items like preventative maintenance for bus operations. And then the light blue represents regional. So if you look at the total data in 2019, the vast majority of transit operations were funded through local sources. In fact, this totals 69%. Regional funding only comprised 23% of total operating costs in fiscal year 2019. Next slide, please. I think this is probably an even better demonstration of that disparity between funding sources to fund transit in the region. So the purple lines represent those routes that are funded entirely through the region. The blue lines represent those routes that have a hybrid of funding. So portion comes from the region, portion comes from local sources. And then the green represents those routes that are funded entirely through local sources. So in 2019, there were only 6 routes total that were funded entirely by the region. There were an additional 23 routes that were funded through a hybrid, so some local funding contribution, some regional, and then the majority, 31 out of the 60, were funded entirely through local sources. Next slide. We see a similar trend on the express bus side. There are a few more routes that are funded entirely by the region. So in fiscal year 2019, we had a total of 21 express and rapid bus routes in the region. 13 were entirely funded by regional sources. 2 were funded by a combination of regional and local sources. And then 6, the rapid buses, were entirely funded through local means. Next slide, please. So what does this mean? So certainly the role of local funding, as well as what we're currently doing, plays an important part in how we approach transit moving forward. Next slide, please. So one of the questions we've been asked, and really one of the unique attributes about Prop 400 relative to Prop 300, is that there's an operations component to Prop 400. There are routes that depend on regional funding to operate. And so one of the items that we've been asked for is what's the total obligation from the region at the end of the Prop 400 program? And so what you see here, we just did a quick calculation based on what's in the current Valley Metro Board approved TLCP for 2025, which is the last full year of Prop 400 collections. And we find that the total operations and maintenance expenses come to $104 million. For perspective, we're currently estimating that total sales tax revenues come in just north of $500 million. So for simplicity's sake, we can say that about 20% of our sales tax collections in the last year of Prop 400 are tied up in ongoing transit operations and maintenance expenses. So that really represents our baseline moving forward. Next slide, please. So as we articulated in the paper, we really see 3 different paths forward, and perhaps it could be a combination of these 3 paths forward. We can revisit a long-range plan-based approach. This would be similar to what we did in Prop 400 when it initiated, where we perhaps identify key regional routes and allocate regional funding to achieve a desired level of service. Another possible option is we could continue with the approach we have today, which is more of a funding-based approach, where we allocate a portion of funding on a city-by-city basis. Third option, which would be new to this region, albeit certainly not a new thing nationally, would be to migrate to more of a formula-based approach where we could build in performance incentives. So at this point, I'll turn it over to Audra to touch a little bit on that, as well as talk about some of the pros and cons of each of these approaches.
Thanks, John. Let's move to the next slide. So what we see across the nation and our peers is this performance-based approach, and there are some very key tenets to its composition. It uses actual data that comes in and is calculated annually based on that data. It's correlated to service productivity and where demand actually is occurring, and incentivizes decisions that adapt transit service to meet existing demand, changing demand, new markets, and regional decisions, and really outlines a very transparent process all along. Next slide. There are, in fact, of course, advantages and perhaps some challenges with each of these three approaches. You know, in summary, if we returned back to the 2003 RTP long-range plan approach, it certainly would allow us to articulate a vision for regional bus service. The constraint, of course, is doing long-range service planning is extremely difficult. It's hard to do bus service planning on a 5, 10, let alone a 25-year basis, and it makes it very difficult to account for short-term changes. Just listening into the management committee meetings at Valley Metro just an hour or two ago, this region addresses bus service changes every 6 months because demand changes, the market changes so frequently, and that's good transit planning. It would be difficult in a long-range plan circumstance to guess what 25 years from today looks like, and I think that flexibility moving forward is a common theme in lessons learned from Proposition 400. We could continue with a fixed allocation approach. It would continue existing policy after the Great Recession that was implemented, but it has some challenges. It's difficult to incentivize regionally based decisions or contiguous service across the region. Fixed rates make it very difficult to account for changes in demographics, market, or demand. And it has its own challenges in delivering equitable outcomes, especially when applied across a large region. Or we could pivot to a formula-based approach. Certainly would promote higher quality regional service and be very adaptive over change, responsive to how markets are changing, and certainly would be consistent with what we see across the nation. It would be another change, a pivot over the course of several years to layer in a new approach and a transition period for which we would have to chart out. Next slide. So we did present this in more detail to the management committee work group last week, and we want to share some of that feedback. We did summarize it in the cover memo that is included in your agenda packet for today. Next slide, but just want to touch on a couple of points. First, I think we heard that there is a heavy importance in maintaining what the region is currently supporting in the existing routes and services that John already outlined. A handful of routes in whole and then several others partially funded. There was an acknowledgement that if funding support was held constant in the region, the transit network could only grow if was funded at the local level. And several managers had articulated at the work group last week that would be difficult to muster the support locally to fund transit. There was a discussion and recognition that our message to the voters needs to be clear. We certainly portrayed a map as part of Proposition 400 about the transit network we hoped to deliver. The Great Recession is going to make that, unfortunately, difficult to achieve, and we'll have to communicate why. But the pivot to an allocation model or funding allocation model is complex and is very difficult to communicate to constituents. And so I think there's an acknowledgement that we need to be able to tell a clear story about what's the region's vision for supporting transit into the future. And then finally, a desire to further explore what that performance-based model might look like here in the region, how we might layer it in, or how, as John mentioned, it might work in combination with a couple other strategies to fully recognize the diversity across the region. Next slide. So we'll wrap it up here with a couple of policy questions that we left off with as well. Next slide. I think we're looking for more feedback, direction this month. We'll be presenting a course to Transportation Policy Committee next week in depth for direction there. And in particular, even though MAG will proceed with sketching out how some of these alternatives might look and could be applied or transitioned over time, I think what we want to hear is what's the information that you need to help inform decisions? What do your policymakers, your mayors need in order to inform direction over the course of the next several months as we chart out a future for future regional transit service as part of the plan and extension effort? Before I turn it over to Chair Arundel, I'll introduce Eric in case he had anything else he wanted to add, but Chairwoman, this does complete our presentation and we're looking forward to feedback.
Thanks, Audra. I'd like to just kind of summarize four takeaways from the discussions we had at the work group last week, as well as Audra and John's presentation today. First, it's clear that we didn't realize the vision that we had for transit under Prop 400. The plan, I think, the Supergrid routes, the express routes that were part of that plan, I think were well thought out. But obviously, the Great Recession certainly reduced our sales tax revenues significantly and caused a number of service reductions. Second point is the concept of jurisdictional equity just doesn't work well. It's fixed. It can't respond to changes in demographics or transit demand. So we think it's really appropriate to look at alternative ways of implementing the transit program. We may end up back where we are, but I think it's important that we look at other alternatives. I think a transit program that incentivizes good transit service is probably where we ought to head. And I think the last point I think is really, really important. And part of what the paper really revealed was the importance of local funding in our public transportation system. As John mentioned, there's only 6 of the 60 routes today that are totally funded by the region, and 23 that are combo funded, and 31 of the 60 are totally locally funded. And so, once again, I think many people who haven't been familiar with Prop 400 and the transit program probably thought the region was paying the full freight on most of the regional transit service in the valley. That just isn't true. Once again, I think it's 22%, I think was the number, something like that. And so, moving forward, as
Eric, we lost you.
Can you hear me now?
A little bit. Try again.
Can you hear me now?
Yep.
Okay. Sorry about that. So we have to continue to look at the importance of local funding to provide public transportation service across the valley. And as difficult it may be to provide local funding in some jurisdictions, I think that's kind of where we are today in our public transportation system. If we could start everything all over again, we'd probably do things differently, but we have a legacy system that's in place today, and I think we have to figure out how to make it work better. So thank you. Be happy to answer any questions. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Eric, Audra, and John. This was a presentation, as mentioned, at work group. We probably spent an hour and a half really digging into the details, and I'll personally say I learned a lot. Was not here for the passing of Prop 400, and I thought this was really informative to truly appreciate that it introduced an operational component, which now impacts our ability, as we're moving forward to a Prop 400 extension question, and truly, again, sobering to realize just to maintain the current system is going to take about 20% of the collections in that last year if the tax is passed as is. So really with that, I encourage feedback and conversation among the member agencies today. This will be moving forward through other policy committees this month, and I think it's important for MAG to hear from this group about, what our thoughts are. I will admit that after an hour and a half, the work group really did not land on a specific path forward, but rather, thank you, Audra, for really trying, beginning to capture the conversation. And so I don't know if anyone from the work group has further, reflection, that we've had more time to absorb the information, or of course, like I said, any member of the group today who would like to offer any thoughts. So with that, I'd like to open it for discussion.
Julie?
Yes, Marcia.
Yeah. So I would just like to reiterate what I mentioned last week. One thing, and I appreciate MAG bringing these options forward. It is always difficult for change. I think we all realize that. But also, last week, it's really hard to do complete policy evaluation on just one portion of our overall transportation system. It would be really good if we would have some look at the overall, Prop 400 extension discussion, rather than these small pieces in the different modes of what makes that whole plan put it all together. So I would just reiterate the same thing I mentioned last week in regards to, it would be really good to have a full evaluation rather than breaking these policy questions off. But I understand the need to get some direction somewhere. So anyway, but it would be nice to have that.
Thank you, Marcia. Other questions or comments from the group?
Madam Chair, Roger.
Roger, thank you.
Yeah, just along the same lines that Marcia brought up. I think we've said this before, and I think it's out there, but one of the things that we keep getting asked by our elected officials is kind of what are the costs for everything for, arterials and freeways and transit, and kind of what is the expected revenues, and just kind of a big picture conglomeration of where are we and how we can explain it to our elected officials would be really helpful. I know we've had it in bits and pieces, and it just can't put our finger on it right now. So I think that would really help. Thank you.
Chairwoman Arundel, if I might just jump in, certainly we can bring back those numbers and demonstrate our still about $50 billion towards a fiscal constraint as we move along. We will be featuring a conversation on revenue projections at the upcoming work group. We think that's important to round out not just federal projections, but of course the sales tax as well. So that'll be a portion that we touch on the meeting on the 28th.
Good to hear. Thank you.
Julie?
Yes, Marcia?
I'm sorry. I also want to just, caution, at least for us, and I think for most communities out there, when you're looking at the performance-based approach and looking at this on an annual basis, not knowing which routes might get what funding, depending on their performance, that sort of thing, it really does make it difficult for the municipalities, at least for us, to be able to project good projections for both revenue and expenditures for our transit services into the future if we're only going to be looking at, changes on an annual basis. So from at least my perspective, we've got to figure out if that is going to be the direction, how that's going to look, because also the citizenry is going to be used to how these routes are running, and it really just makes it hard for the elected officials locally to be able to make good quality decisions into the future on some of these routes. So I just wanted to add that. Thank you.
Julie, this is Jeff. Can you hear me?
Yes, Jeff, please go ahead.
Real quick. Thank you. Great comments, I think, by Marcia and Roger, and you as well, Julie. I think we're curious if we did go to a performance-based formula kind of allocation model, we'll definitely have to learn more. And I think, as the working group brought up, is how will that play in different cities and how will that play to our residents is exactly right. I think Eric is exactly right. There was some recognition of the interrelationship of the various life cycle programs beyond transit. And so to have something that just has an allocation model in one category didn't really work well with other plan-based models. So yeah, great conversation that we had. Love the direction you all are going on this, and look forward to having the discussion, looking at the financials and then really trying to look at the broader context of all these projects and seeing what we can work with the amount. So it really is looking at holistically will be so important. Thanks.
Other comments, questions from membership?
Julie,
Yes, Kevin.
just to piggyback, at the work group, we referred to this kind of hybrid as the LA model. It seems to me that the underlying issues are going to be built around trust on how that model is assembled. Not only trust between us and the citizens we're asking to vote, because there's going to be a tremendous amount of you need to trust that we're going to do the right thing, but I think just trust within the different jurisdictions. And so one of my questions is, obviously the LA model has been in place. There have been other models across the country. Was curious at how difficult it was for them to put the criteria together. At the end of the day, that plan is all based on the assumptions and how you weight the components of the plan. So I was really kind of curious at how difficult it was to achieve that. And if so, is it reasonable that we could to be able to get far enough along on how that plan looks to meet the timeline we're on for getting this thing to the voters?
Chairwoman Arundel, it's a great question and observation. You know, one of LA was just one example of this allocation model that's really replicated across the country. And, you know, with LA, actually, it's very simple. There's only two criteria really used to anchor those allocations. So we can do a little bit more research, you know, in what generations before came and how that was negotiated. But we can also look at different criteria in other systems. But Farebox, certainly performance of routes as well. Demand, those are criteria for which pretty stable and used across our other systems, but we can certainly bring a little bit more of that information back.
Chair Arundel, I'd like to just jump in too. You know, one of the unique features we have in this region, unique across the country, is that, you know, the LA model or most of the transit models that we've looked at out there, the allocations are from a regional level down to transit properties. We're talking about here is quite a bit different. We're actually talking about allocating regional dollars to cities and towns. And so once again, this isn't the way it works in other areas. And once again, it's part of the legacy that we have, the way that our transit program has developed over the decades. But once again, rather than allocating it to transit operators, we're allocating money to you all to make transit decisions. And so once again, it's really difficult from a regional perspective to maintain regional service if the decision making is at the individual jurisdiction level. And so we know we've run into that issue under the jurisdictional equity model, where perhaps one jurisdiction might not agree with a route that needs to cross their jurisdiction. And so once again, the system we have in place today makes it really difficult to make good regional transit decisions in terms of supporting mobility across the valley, as opposed to within a jurisdiction. So once again, it's a different orientation that we have from a regional perspective.
Anyone else?
Madam Chair, this is John Quinckrey.
Yeah, John, please go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to underscore, just to support the comments that were previously made, agree with those as well. And the need for the holistic information, I think, is going to be critical in probably the more near-term steps as we're making a lot of progress here on these issues. But I did have a question. I thought our overall program, as part of formulating the entire RTP, included some polling or additional citizen outreach on different aspects of the program. And I was curious as to what the current thinking was for checking in with prospective voters and particularly as it relates to transit participation, use, and that general subject. Thanks.
Yeah, great question, Chairwoman Arundel, Mr. Cross. Great question, timely. We certainly are soliciting feedback right now actively on our website, getting a lot of good feedback based around the goals and outcomes. I will say we'll be summarizing that information, of course, bringing it back to you, but just one observation, it's extremely consistent with what we got out of the values mapping a year and a half ago. We will be proceeding after the election and preparing this winter to do some polling, not only just to check in and see where constituents' economic appetites are, security aspects in terms of what they're looking at for the upcoming year or two, especially as we're thinking about a decision on a date for prospective election, but then also the opportunity to ask a couple of these questions that are germane to the conversations we have, whether or not it's investment or an increase in investment and their appetite around it, and even the composition potentially to further a transit outcome if there was more funding made available. So we're going to be doing that work this winter, at least to start to get an initial check-in with the public and where they're at, use that information into our scenario planning as well, hopefully to inform better decisions as we weigh trade-offs early in that process.
All right, thank you, Audra and John and Eric. I think we'll move on to item number 7, which is legislative update. Mr. Pryor.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Apologize, your notes were not updated. There is no legislative update today. Thank you.
All right. Well, then item number 8, request for future agenda items. Any requests from membership? Okay, item number 9 is comments from the committee. Are there any announcements from the membership? Well, with that, business is now concluded and our meeting is adjourned. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.